Saki mbwembwe na kwele mchele kwa kuku kumwaga. Sako na wapenda haya tusema nitasikia.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about globalization and language and the African exceptionalism. And I speak of African exceptionalism because in the Americas and Australia and New Zealand, indigenous languages have been displaced by European languages. But this has not been happening in Africa. And yet Africa was colonized too, and a whole lot of literature has been telling people, watch out, English is coming and is going to displace your languages. And I have said, no, that's not what's been happening. And I'll explain why Africa has been more resilient in the face of the expansion of Indo-Europeans and their languages. And one of the reasons is that before Africa came in contact with Europeans, Africans had been trading with the Arabs for centuries. And that particular Africa had developed interesting networks of communication with the Arabs using particular lingua francas, such as Songhai. And those contacts didn't drive African languages out. The African languages maintained their own functions, and the lingua francas were used specifically for communication with the outsiders that they traded with. And moreover, interpreters played a particular role in those particular kinds of contacts. And what we have to notice in this particular setting is the fact that the Africans had developed some kingdoms and empires. They are shown on the map as overlapping. That's because they kept replacing one another over time, in the course of time. And when the Europeans arrived, starting in the 15th century, and for about a century and a half, the Africans interacted especially with the Portuguese, represented on this map by the green arrows and the green spaces and the green circle, the green dots, okay? But that's a more complicated history because the Portuguese actually developed a chain of coastal trade force around the coast of Africa and along the Indian Ocean and on the West Pacific all the way to China. And up to the late 19th century, the Portuguese and the Europeans and the Africans and Asians traded in Portuguese. Portuguese was the lingua franca. And if you speak of globalization, Portuguese was then a global language for trade. But then in the 17th century, the Dutch, the English, and the French engaged in that trade and confiscated a whole lot of those trade force on the coast. But they continued to trade with the Africans in Portuguese. And now the question is, who was speaking Portuguese? The Africans didn't all learn Portuguese. Actually, many of them had to worry more about their survival than in treating, than in interacting with the Portuguese. And that trade, it was not like a bazaar style trade market where everybody would come with the gold or the ivory or the salt or the slave to trade. You know, these are highly valued commodities. and the people that could trade them are the people that were in high status. So the kings, members of the royal entourage, these are the people that were involved in the trade. And the tradition in these kinds of contacts was to use intermediaries. And as we read history, the intermediaries who consisted mostly of people identified as Creoles or the Signards in Senegal. These are the people that became go-betweens and the people that became intermediaries. And later on in the 19th century, when the Europeans decided to change this coastal trade force and expand them into exploitation colonies, they would train more Africans to learn their languages, and those are the people that are identified in history as colonial auxiliaries. And the colonial auxiliaries are the people that would work for the colonial administration. And those are the people that have become involved in European languages and have learned to speak European languages, not as mother tongue necessarily, but as lingua francas that they would use to interface between the European colonizers and the masses of the indigenous people. It's remarkable that since then, until now, after independence, and more than 60 years after the independence of most African countries, the European languages are still spoken by small fractions of the indigenous populations. And that's very significant. That is different from what has happened in the Americas, where the European languages have become the dominant languages. And in such a way that when you speak of Indo-European languages, they are spoken not only in Europe and in South Asia, but they have expanded in Siberia, but they have become the dominant languages in the Americas, in part of South Africa, but not for all South Africans, and in Australia and in New Zealand. Okay, whereas in Africa it's left blank here because that's really not how we should represent Africa as places where European languages have become dominant languages. The other thing, a byproduct of the European expansion, is the emergence of languages known as Creoles, represented here in red. These are not individual languages, these are regions where Creoles have developed. And in blue are places where languages called pidgins have developed, like Nigerian pidgin or Cameroon pidgin or Tok Pisin in Papua New Guinea. Those are the languages in question. But as things develop in the 20th century, when people represent draw maps of languages in Africa, we see these competing maps here. The maps that most people in Europe will see is the map that most people will see in Europe or in the West is the map on the left side, where Africa is divided between Francophone countries in blue, Anglophone countries in red, Arabic countries in the north, and a small pocket of Spanish-speaking country, that Equatorial Guinea, and then Ethiopia here represented for some reason as other languages. And what people don't talk about is the reality of the majority of people, where you find this big combination of different languages. You know, almost 2,000 languages spoken all over Africa, and these are the indigenous languages of Africa, and people don't mention them. The languages that are represented here, as I said earlier, they are spoken at most by 20% of the population. That's, the continuation of that elite class that in the colonial period was identified as colonial auxiliaries. And now they are the people ruling the country, the elite members of the population, people with university or college degrees, and people that have become fluent enough to use the European languages, not necessarily as mother tongue, but as lingua francas. Whereas the regular people, the masses of the population, they continue to speak indigenous languages. And so that is contrary to what we find in the Americas and Australia, where first of all, in the case of the United States, that non-Anglo-Europeans that came from continental Europe or from Ireland gave up the heritage languages for English. And gradually Native Americans have been losing their languages, shifting to English. And if you go to a place like Brazil, it's another way around. People are shifting to Portuguese. And in the rest of Latin America, it's Spanish that has become the dominant language, okay? But in Africa, the story is different. And the challenge for us is to explain in a more or less systematic way why Africa is behaving in an exceptional way. I'm focusing on Africa because of the nature of the organization. I could have taken the example of parts of Asia to explain the same thing. And what we find is that except partly for South Africa and Algeria, Africa was colonized on the exploitation model. Okay, the little bit of history that I can provide in the little time that I have is that we see in the late 18th century, the United States becoming independent through the American Revolution. And toward the end of the same century, it's Haiti that also fights for independence, okay? And it becomes independent in the very early 19th century. And now, little by little, the different settlement colonies of the Americas are becoming independent. That threatens the purpose of colonization for Europeans. And at the same time, that's the time of the Industrial Revolution. And now the Europeans have to turn elsewhere for the raw materials that they need in order to fuel the Industrial Revolution. They turn to Africa, and they couldn't guarantee possession and control of the raw materials by sticking to the earlier trade colonization with Africa. So they will change the system into the exploitation colonization through intermediaries and, manipulating the relationships with African rulers and so forth in order to control all that thing, all those raw materials. But the other things that we notice is, unlike settlement colonization, the exploitation colonization was socially and culturally exclusionary, not assimilationist. In other words, you don't force the colonized populations to adopt your culture. Actually, in a way, you prefer to keep them out of participating in your culture. And Europeans were not very much interested in seeing Africans speaking their languages. There's a lot of social discrimination, social segregation in Africa. In the colonization of Africa, Europeans live in their separate quarters away from the indigenous people. And the European colonizers and settlers were in the minority demographically. And those that have remained in Africa are still in the minority. The people that replace the European administrators, the ruling class in Africa, they are an elite class and they live also in their own separate quarters. They use European languages a lot, but they still have to maintain relationships with members of their families that don't have the same kind of achievements and still operate in indigenous languages. And they still have to buy food from the people that don't speak European languages. And they need helpers that do not speak European languages. And so the elite class is bound to be multilingual in European languages and indigenous languages. And since there are very, very few jobs in Africa that operate in European languages, the African economy was developed to serve the needs of the European Industrial Revolution and the European economy afterwards. And Europeans were content in learning the language of the people that work for them rather than forcing the people working for them to learn their languages. And that tradition has continued in Africa. And when you think about the position of European languages in Africa, unlike in settlement colonies, the European languages were superposed on indigenous languages, primarily for communicative functions introduced by Europeans. They are not spoken as vernaculars by population majorities. So you're going to find European languages used in the government. You're going to find European languages in the higher ranks of the colonial administration or European style administration that has been adopted by Africa. The senior officers in the army, but not the privates, okay? The senior officers in the police force, but not the regular policemen, and those kinds of things. Teachers in higher level of schools, but except in secondary school and professors at the university, but in elementary school, even though the teachers are encouraged to use European languages, very often they have to explain in indigenous languages because the pupils in the schools don't know the European languages. They are still learning the European languages. And so these are important factors that have protected indigenous African languages from being displaced by European languages. Whereas in the settlement colonies, it's different. It's a different story. Your child goes to school, your child better know the European language that has prevailed in that particular polity. So that's another story. And from there on, the child proceeds in the education speaking the European language rather than anything else. And before you know it, the non-European language, the indigenous language becomes redundant and people give it up. It was the same story for continental Europeans who immigrated to the United States. Little by little, the languages of continental Europeans became redundant. They became less advantageous because they were not competitive economically and politically, and eventually as the Europeans started mixing across national boundaries, those languages, German, French, Italian, and a host of other languages have disappeared from, as vernaculars at least, from the scene. And so in Africa, there is no significant competition between the European languages and the indigenous languages, because in order for there to be competition, there must be the same domains of use. But as I said earlier, the European languages were superposed to indigenous languages. And that's why we can speak of African exceptionalism. African languages, indigenous African languages are not threatened by European languages. If anything, we should be worrying about whether some indigenous languages in urban centers may not start threatening the position that has been assumed by European languages to date, especially with the rise of nationalism. So we have very little time, and that is all I wanted to present, and that is it.
Nanipaga moyo nikianza kulia chozi nafutia.